Today's daf is Mem Ches. We are Mem Zayin at base 47b, and the discussion is whether there's a concept of hayil or not. Whether we could say that even though that right now it's not practically needed to cook or light a fire or anything that would be permissible on Yantiv with a specific need, whether that would nevertheless be permissible because in case or if that were to be the case, it would be practical. And the Gemara tried to bring proof from the Brisa that said that somebody who cooks basa b'chalav or a gid anasha and milk on Yantiv will have 5 malchus. And the fifth one is the lighting the fire, and lighting the fire should not be a problem, even though you're cooking something that's totally prohibited. But the fire could be useful for many other things if I needed to cook something else. So it should not be a prohibition. And so Rabba, who holds of Hayil, says no, you have to remove that and put in that the prohibition of the wood was muktzah. So the Gemara says, but muktzah, where's the Torah prohibition for that? He said, well, because it says in the positive, you should prepare what you need for Shabbos by the month. And the prohibition is because it says you can't do malacha. And this would then be included in the concept of malacha. To which Rav Chisda says to Rabbah, but you told us not so. Abaye says to Rabbah that you told us not so. Atu da amris, but you told us a story. Ba'imine Rav Chisda, that Rabbah, you told us that you once asked Rav Chisda, or that you had asked Rav Huna. Hevi said me'efer v'shachte tamid b'yantiv mount. If somebody brought a lamb out from the field, from the swamp, meaning it was out in pasture at the beginning of Yantiv, it was not in a barn, shed, corral. It was out in the open, and so therefore it had not been designated or prepared for Yantiv. So it's essentially muktzah because you didn't assume that you were going to have this available at Yantiv, and you bring it as a carbon. Is it valid or not? And you said to us about that scenario. Now this is a drash on a pasuk in Yecheskel in talking about the karbanos b'nei Yisrael bring. One lamb from tzayin. Tzayin is a general term for sheep and goat. Min hamasayim, one of 200. The Gemara is going to explain what this means. Mimashki Yisrael, from the drink of Yisrael, for a mincha, an ola, and a shlamim, etc. So the drash is like this: Seh v'lei b'chor. The idea is that the word seh is both male and female. It's a term for lambs or for young sheep, regardless of whether male or female. And a bechor is only male. So seh tells you that the korban would have to be from something that isn't born as a kodesh, as a bechor, but rather simple korban. Achas, it's one, meaning an individual, v'la meiser, but not one of 10, not the tithe korban. Min hatzayin. And it has to be tzayin, v'lei palgas. That it's unique. There's a there's a term for a young lamb that's a keves in its first year, and older than that it becomes an ayil. However, there's the 13th month, the entire 13th month of its life. It's an in-between stage, so like a teenager, not a child, not an adult. It's a palgas, and that's not a time that it's valid as a korban. So min hatzayin tells you some of the tzayin, but not all of the tzayin, and it excludes the palgas. The palgas is this 13th month lamb, so it's not neither here nor there. Min hamasai. Now it says 1 of 200. Where's there a requirement of 1 of 200? So it's not in the lamb itself. That's talking about the nesachim, the libations, the oil, the wine that is poured on the mizbeach as a part of the carbon. So that means that there has to have been 200 of it in plus what you take out, 200 times what you take out in the pit in the wine pit in order for you to be allowed to use this. What scenario could that be that you need a nullification of 1 of 200, one ratio to 200? That's talking about arla that is nullified 1 in 200. And as Rashi points out, this is not the source for arla being nullified in 1 in 200. Arla being the first fruit within the first 3 years of a vine. But this is not the source for it, but we already know that it is nullified. And here, the meaning of this pasuk of 1 in 200 is wine that you can even use wine that had come from a nullification of arla in 1 in 200. Mimashke Yisrael, from the drink of Yisrael, what does that teach us? Minamutal Yisrael, that which is permissible to Yisrael. That means that the carbon has to come from something that you're allowed to eat, you're allowed to take benefit from. It's yours. Mikan Amru, and from based on that we said, you cannot bring libation wine, pouring the nisach on the mizbeach min hatevel if you hadn't tithed it yet, because it has to be permissible to you to be eaten. Perhaps muktzah would also be the same. You're not allowed to bring it from when it's muktzah, separated from you. You're not allowed to benefit from it on Yantiv, or use it on Yantiv. Amris ma tevel miyuchad iser gufay garam. Tevel is an intrinsic invalidation on account of it being fruit that you hadn't tied. So afkol she'isa gufay garam. So too that the hint in Yecheskel, or the meaning in Yecheskel, that what's permissible to you is also talking about something that's invalid on account of its own invalidation, its own usage, its own intrinsic halachic obligations that you would have to something else. Yotza muktzah. Muktzah, however, is not intrinsically invalid, but rather it's rather that it's Shabbos and you hadn't prepared it for Shabbos or designated for Shabbos, or you specifically undesignated it for Shabbos by sending it out into the field, etc. That's when it's going to be invalid. Now, so he said that was the response to the question of whether you can bring a carbon tumid from muktzah, and it says muktzah is not excluded because it's not an iser gufa, it's not a prohibition or invalidation based on its own problem, its own intrinsic halachic status, but rather something else makes that status. Shabbos or Yantif is going to make that status, and so therefore it's going to be a valid carbon. Now, coming back to our question, so Abaye tells Rabbah, the Amris is a muktzah d'oraisa, and if you tell me that the concept of muktzah is a Torah prohibition, so Mali is a gufa, Mali is a davach, who cares whether it's its own intrinsic invalidation or an external invalidation, it's invalid. Must be that there is no prohibition of muktzah on a Torah level. And as a rabbinic prohibition, you can say, well, it's not intrinsic, and therefore you can bring it. V'oid, and besides, ha'atu da'amris chilik malachas l'Shabbos ve'en chilik malachas l'Yantif. And besides, even if it would be a Torah prohibition, you taught us that the concept of chilik malachas, and this is a concept that when somebody transgresses multiple prohibitions of Shabbos, so they cook, in order to cook, they lit a fire. In order to light the fire, they chopped wood. So for Shabbos, that's all going to be each individual malacha is going to be its own transgression. Whereas in Yantif and Chilik malachas, that all counts as a single transgression of Yantif, even though there are multiple different categories of transgression. And so over here, you want to tell me muktzah is a Torah prohibition, but for Yantif, there's going to be no distinction between lighting using this wood, which is muktzah, and you already had the prohibition of yantif in cooking, something that's prohibited because you're only allowed to cook on yantif that which is actually edible for yantif. So it can't be that it's talking about muktzah, and in fact, that would be a problem on this second question that Rabbi asked. Would be a problem even if it said havara, just the igniting of the fire, which was the original text. That also would be a problem. So he said, you're right. Of course, just the muktzah of yantif, of not having prepared this wood for fire for yantif would not be sufficient to count as a Torah prohibition. However, there is a muktzah of a Torah prohibition, a prohibition of benefit from something that's avodah zarah. Ella apik havara, remove the lighting of the fire, and the fifth prohibition would be the atzi asherah. These woods come from an asherah tree. Vazhara, and the Torah prohibition for that would be mihacha v'lo yidbak b'yakam that you may have any nothing may cling to your hand from that which is desecrated and pushed out as avodah zarah. And Yidbak Miyad Chama'uma tells you that you can't have any benefit. It can't stick to your hand at all, meaning you can't have any benefit from it. It's avodah zarah. So Ravacha, the son of Rava, said to Abaye, "V'nilki nami mishum v'leitav teva mesecha." And besides, if that's the Torah prohibition, so then you have another Torah prohibition besides for the benefit of avodah zarah. You have a prohibition of bringing avodah zarah into your house, as it says, "Lo tova teva b'secha." You're not allowed to bring it the disgrace into your house. Ela apik havara va'aylat hektish. So rather, you have to remove the havara. The fifth prohibition in this case is the lighting of the fire, and rather it's the use of hektish wood. V'azhara mihacha, and this is the source of it. V'asherim tisrafun be'esh. It says the asheras of avodah zarah need to be burnt. But do not do so to Hashem your God. In other words, don't use the wood that belongs to the Beis HaMikdash and burn it. Whereas the avodah zarah you must burn, you cannot do so to Hashem. So you cannot do so to. So that would be the prohibition, the fifth prohibition of the fifth prohibition in that case. And so we don't have proof that you do say hayil or don't say hayil. That case over there is the fifth prohibition is having used wood of hektish. Amar Rami Bar Chava. So we had seen that in the case of our Mishnah, there was a question about whether or not to separate challah, and in separating challah, you would make sorry if it was tummy, and you have to separate challah. You're going to have a piece of bread that nobody can eat. You're baking it on Yontif. You can't give it to the Kohen. You can't burn it because you don't burn kachim on Yontif. So Rabbi Eliezer said, go ahead and bake it, and later you'll take the challah. Ben Beseira said that just put it into cold water so it doesn't rise. And Rabbi Yeshua said, go ahead, let it rise. It's not yours. And the Gemara had explained the concept of hayil. Now we're going to try and see whether Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua are based on the same machlokas of Rabbah and of Chisda, whether or not we say this concept of hayil, that since if I had guests, or since if I could have done, since I could annul the vow, the statement of challah, so therefore, right now I can benefit from it. And the same would be whether I say the concept of hayil in general, since if I had guests, I would need to bake and cook for them, and so therefore I could cook and bake just in case a guest show up. So Rami Bar Chama said, "Hadar of Chisda v'Rabba." This machlokas of Rav Chisda, Rabba machlokas, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua. That is the meaning of the machlokas in our Mishnah itself. And in our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer says that since he says since if guest I can bake this on account of hayil, since if I would need it I could use it. So therefore I can bake each one. The idea being, if I wanted, I can eat each bread that I put into the oven. I could say, if I want, I can eat this one and make a different one challah. And the next one, I can say, if I want, I could eat this one and I make a different one challah. And even each one, I could really make each one not challah and just a small portion of it challah. So I have a right to bake this because I can't, because I'm going to take challah just from its end. In any case, so since if I wanted, I could eat this one, and therefore it's going to be permissible to bake each and every one, even though that one of these is going to end up not being edible. And Rabbi Yeshua says no, since Rabbi Yeshua is going to say, since you're not eating each one. Right now, we know you're not going to eat each one, and therefore we don't say hayil. That's the meaning of the Mishnah that is suggested now by Rami Bar Chama. So Rabbi Eliezer Savar, Rin and hayil, and therefore he says you can bake each one of these breads because if you wouldn't pronounce it as challah, you're allowed to eat it. And Rabbi Yeshua says Savar Le Rin and hayil. Amar Papa Vidilma, maybe it's not true. Maybe even though that there is a concept of hayil that Rav Chisda and Rabbah say that we can differentiate between our case in the Mishnah, where we're talking about baking the challah meaning the separated dough that is tameh and the kohen can't eat it and nobody can eat it, versus in the case of guests coming and you're cooking extra on Yom Tov afternoon, even though that is going to end up being eaten the next day. Adka lika amar Rabbi Eliezer, because maybe Rabbi Eliezer only said his halacha hasam damrin and hayil. Maybe he only says hayil in the Mishnah because each and every bread is edible. Hayil ela de beidna the ka'ayle letanura kachada v'chada chazir le'ledidei. He himself can eat every single one of these matzahs that he puts into the oven, because he can say, look, this is the one I'm going to end up eating. I want to eat this one. Every single one of these is edible because he doesn't pronounce it as challah. The one that he ends up pronouncing as challah is not going to be eaten, but each one he could say, look, this one I can put into the oven because it's edible to me. It doesn't have to be the one that's challah. But over here, in our case, he's fully satisfied. He's full. He's not eating anymore right now. And so when he's cooking and baking, it's for tomorrow. And maybe if guests come, it's going to be edible today. That's great, but there are no guests, so there's no one to cook for. It's not really edible for him. It's only for guests if they were to come. Maybe there he wouldn't say hayil. Maybe in that case he would not say that if something would have happened, then it would be permissible. That's too far-fetched. It's too theoretical. And also we could say the reverse. Maybe there's no comparison between Rabbi Yeshua and Rav Chisda. Because Rabbi Yeshua only said in the Mishnah that we're not going to say hayil and we're not going to allow you to bake these breads, and so you just let it become chametz and it's not your worry because it doesn't belong to you. Hasam the lamrin and hayil. You don't say hayil over there. Ella the ikachada the lechazile, because there's for sure one that's not edible. You have to take challah, so something's got to give. Even though each and every one of them, as you put it into the oven, you can say, this one I'm going to eat. And so you're allowed to put it in the oven because if you wanted, you can make this one edible. However, in the end, when every single one's in the oven, every single one of them, out of those, one of them is going to be inedible to you or anyone else. No one's going to be able to eat it. It's entirely inedible. And everybody understands that ultimately there's going to be some of what went into the oven that's not edible to anybody. So therefore, he doesn't allow hayil, because there, even though that independently or individually. If you looked at each one individually, you can say this one, if I wanted, I can make it edible. But ultimately, there's going to be one or some that are not going to be edible. Aval hacha, the chazami is la'orchim. But when you're cooking on Yontiv afternoon, it's edible food to anybody that would want it. The fact that no one wants it doesn't mean, right, everybody's full right now, doesn't mean that it's not edible. We would say that there is hoil. This, by the way, one of the great poskim of our day, Rav Asher Weiss, says this is the basis for how we use Eruv Tafshilin during Corona. Before Yontiv, he asked the question, how do we use Eruv Tafshilin? The concept of Eruv Tafshilin we talked about is that you're allowed to bake on Yontiv for Shabbos, because really I could be baking for Yontif itself, because maybe guests will show up. And if guests show up, I need to be able to serve them something. So I can cook and bake on Yontif for Shabbos, having made an Eruv, started cooking for Shabbos already before Yontif started. That's the Eruv. And I can continue cooking on Yontif itself, because after all, if guests show up, then it's going to be permissible to be. I will have cooked for Yontif itself. Now, that's all nice of when guests can show up, but when no one's walking out of their house, never mind being welcomed into your house. So how in the world can you say maybe guests will show up? You're not letting them in the house. Nobody's coming. So what does it mean? Maybe guests will come. He said, but if we see over here, the concept is more that it's edible. Maybe I'll decide I'll eat. Maybe you'll decide you'll eat. Someone in the house may want to eat. So you're allowed to cook for Yontif, for Shabbos. It's not about specifically that guests are going to come, but rather that whether it's entirely inedible versus that it's edible, it's really permissible to be eaten. And the term maybe guests will come is sort of like a euphemism for it may be needed, it may be eaten. And it wouldn't be the first time that someone ate after they're full just because they wanted what they were looking at. So that's the concept of hoil over here. We see that it doesn't have to be specifically that a guest will show up, or rather that it's really, the concept is that it's edible today already, so you're allowed to cook it. Amru Rabbanan Kameidu Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yirmiyah Kibla, Rabbi Zera LeKibla. So whether or not this is connected to our Mishnah or different than our Mishnah, it was said in front of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Yirmiyah accepted this statement of Rabbi Bachama, and Rabbi Zera did not. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah and Rabbi Zera milsa de kashila ma'ase kama shnibim b'may pliger Rabbi Lezer Yeshua. We now have a good explanation of what is the basis of the machlokas Rabbi Lezer Yeshua that we've been struggling with for years. Hashta amru mishmei de gavra rabba v'lei nikabla. Now that they told us this explanation in the name of a great person, Rabbi Bar Chama, and you don't want to accept it, he says, but what should I do? How can I accept the Tanina? Because we have a brisa that tells us a different explanation of Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. That Amalei Rabbi Yeshua ledvarecha, because Rabbi Yeshua tells Rabbi Eliezer, according to your explanation, according to your explanation, he's transgressing that he's cooking on Yantiv. It says, do not do any work. V'shasekle, Rabbi Eliezer didn't respond. V'im isa le'malei, time of the ding, mishum hoil. Why didn't Rabbi Eliezer respond? Look, I'm not transgressing, because if I wanted, I can eat each and every one. I have the concept of hoil, that if I wanted, I can eat this. If is a good response, that Rabbi Eliezer didn't say it. Amar lei. So Rabbi Yirmiyah tells Rabbi Zera, I understand. You don't want to accept it because the brisa because Rabbi Eliezer is not recorded in the brisa as having said this response. We also have a brisa the other way. Rabbi Eliezer, there's another brisa that says that Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua, how can you say that you should just separate the challah for gift to the kohen? You can't give it to the kohen, because in any case the kohen has nothing to do with it, because it's tamei, So just let it become chametz. But you're going to transgress bal yirah bal yamatzi. You're going to transgress having chametz of yours in your possession. V'shasik lein in the brisa doesn't have any response from Rabbi Yeshua. Would you say that he didn't respond? But we have a response recorded in our Mishnah. In our Mishnah, we have a response that Tanan, this is not chametz that you are responsible for, mishum bal yirah bal yamatzi, because it says bal yirah lecha. It says le'yirah lecha. You should not see for yourself. It's got to be your chametz, and this is not yours. Once you separated it as challah, it belongs to the general Kohen population. And it doesn't, no Kohen is going to transgress because it doesn't belong to a particular Kohen, but it's not yours anymore. It's now Mammon Kohen. It belongs to the Kohanim. So Rabbi Yeshua did respond. The Brisa doesn't record it. So too, the Brisa doesn't record Rabbi Eliezer's response, even though that he could have just said, Hayil. You're going to have to say the Brisa doesn't record his response, but in the Mishnah, it records his response. Maybe in the Brisa, it doesn't record his response, but there is a response, and it's recorded elsewhere in another Brisa. Tanya, Rabbi So Rabbi said the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, that you're allowed to bake them. And Rabbi Yitzchak says that the halacha is like ben Beseira, that you're not allowed to, you put it into cold water to keep it from fermenting, from rising. So the Gemara is going to ask, so what's the correct way? How much dough should you make on Pesach that is appropriate, that you can properly follow through to separate challah or it won't rise and become chametz? Kama shir isa. So how much dough should you make on Pesach if you're going to be baking, so as not to run into a chametz issue? So Rabbi Shmuel ben Asher, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika Omer, bechitin kavin ubesarin shloshos kavin. Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, he says for wheat 2 kav, and for barley 3 kav. However, Rabbi Nassan Rabbi Nassan says no, the other way around. Chiluf advarim, that barley needs less; it's quicker to ferment, and you need a smaller dough to be able to do it quickly and not become chametz. But for wheat, you could do 3 kav. But we have another brisa. And then that Rabbi Yochanan, the son of Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika, said actually for wheat 3 kav and for barley 4 kav. It depends. Fine flour, even in 2 kav, will be of wheat would be sufficient to ferment and to rise. Or that's a maximum you should do without really running into problems. But with a coarser, not such a good flour, so there you're going to even 3. You can even do 3 because it's less likely to become chametz, or not as quick to become chametz. Amal Rav Papa Shmaminas Rav Papa said, from here we know geri and chitis chasichta. That wheat is worse than barley. In bad wheat is worse than bad barley, because bad wheat, the difference between how quickly it'll ferment goes from it's okay to do 2 kav, and bad wheat is 3 kav, so it jumps a third. In downgrade, whereas barley, you can safely do fine flour barley 3 kav, but in bad barley flour you can already do 4. You can do 4 kav. So there it only jumps down. It drops in grade 1/3. 1/4. Medigri and sari chasichta misarim al yaisa. So we see that bad wheat is worse, a farther downgrade than bad barley is. Dilu hasam tilta, because wheat downgrades a third. And over here it downgrades only by barley only a quarter. In any case, so the suggestion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka, or the halacha of Rabbi Yochanan ben Breka, and Rabbi Nassim is that either 2 or 3 kav when fine flour of either wheat or barley, or 3 and 4 kav for bad, for good or bad. For bad flour, wheat or barley. So wheat would be 3 and barley would be 4. If it's bad flour, that's the maximum that you would use to make a dough without running into problems of it becoming chametz. Amar Rav kava melugna lepischa b'chein lechala. The measure a kav of this place lugna. That's what you could bake for Pesach, and actually that's the size also for challah. And he says so. The measure of challah is what you're allowed to make as your dough for Pesach, and not run into problems. So now we go to Mem Ches Amud Beis. How much is that? Chameshes Ruvayim Kemach. It is 5 quarters of flour in 5 quarters of a lug, meaning 1 lug and a quarter, which is the lug of tzipori, which 7 and a bit of the midbari, which in Eruvin we saw the calculation of how they downgraded the size of the measure, which means that you had more. You have more flour in each kav, so therefore you need less amount. So it's only 5 quarters as opposed to the 7 and a bit quarters, meaning 1 3/4 down to 1 1/4 because the measure size just became larger. So what does it mean? The 5 quarters of a lug is actually the same size as a single kav of this lugna of this place of measure. Amar Rav Yosef, Hani Nashi Didan. So Rav Yosef says, what's practical for our women who are baking, so our women, what their minig is, Rav Yosef says that they would make small doughs for Pesach. Amali Abayas said, Rav Yosef, my daitach l'chumra. You think that this is you being strict on the end of Pesach from the Pesach perspective because you're making small batches of dough, therefore there's less chance of it fermenting and becoming chametz. Chumra dasu leikulo, but that stringency of making smaller batches is actually a leniency to come mafkele mechala because you're exempting yourself from challah. Amalei the avda Rabbi Eliezer says no, they're still going to take challah, but they do so like Rabbi Eliezer. The Tanana, as we learned in the Mishnah in regards to challah, Rabbi Eliezer says after you take the breads, you made small breads, you took it out of the oven and you put them into a basket. Hasal matzar for l'challah, the basket itself would combine them even after they're baked to count as challah. So they make small batches of bread, small matzahs. They put them in a basket, and when they have enough that it equals chameshes ruvayim kemach, the measure of a kav and a quarter for or this kav lugna for a challah, and once it hits that number, they actually separate challah from the already baked matzah. But Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel halacha Rabbi Eliezer, and that is the halacha, as Shmuel said. But Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said that it's only these Babylonian breads that actually are still sticky and would essentially bite each other, meaning that they touch each other and stick to each other. But if it's these long breadsticks that don't actually stick to each other, that would not be included, even though it's in the same basket. It would not combine for the measure of challah. So he says no. No, but Rabbi Chanina already said that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, even in a kiyachin, even in these breads that are not sticking to each other. The halacha is that if they're in the same basket, they become obligated as a single entity in challah, and you can separate challah even after it's baked from all of them. What about if it's just a flat piece of a tablet, a piece of wood, cutting board? It doesn't have edges, so it doesn't have. It's not a container. It doesn't have walls. You need it inside a vessel, and it's not there. Or in the on the airspace of the vessel, meaning above the vessel, and it works. Teku. We don't know the answer. Halachically, the way we do it today, if somebody didn't take challah, the separation from a batch of bread, whether it's bread, challah, or anything else that's obligated in challah, so you put them all together, either in a basket, or you put a towel or a sheet over it. You put something over them, so that would now combine them, and then you could take challah from one over all of them. So this is the idea that even after it's baked, so Rav Yosef says to Abaye, we're not exempting ourselves from challah. Rather, we're just not separating it prior to having baked it. This way, you bake everything, and then once they're combined, so you can take small amounts of dough, make small amounts of dough, so that they would not run into issues of becoming chametz. After all the small batches, you combine them, and then you're obligated to challah. Tanya Rabbi Eliezer Masal Mitzarfon. Rabbi Eliezer says the basket will combine them. Rabbi Yeshua Eimer Tanur Mitzarfon. Rabbi Yeshua says that not only not only a basket, but even in the oven itself, that would combine it. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Eimer Ki Koresh Al Baver Shanoishches Zumizu Mitzarfos. That it would have to be these Babylonian breads that actually are doughy and stick to each other, versus not. And the halacha is, as we saw, that it doesn't have to be that they stick to each other. The Mishnah now is going to get into two opinions of whether several people using the same oven, whether they can start kneading at the same time, or they would have to stagger themselves so that this way nobody's waiting with their dough until the other had completed their baking. Rabbi Shmuel Shalosh Nashim Lashes Ka'achas V'Ifetz B'Tanur Echad Zu Achazu. 3 women can start kneading their dough at once, and each one will bake one after the other. This is hard for us to imagine because our baking of breads usually takes, a long time, half hour, 45 minutes, an hour, depending on what kind of bread you're baking and how hot you made the oven. But they were talking about flat breads that was slapped onto the wall of an oven. So these only take moments, whether it's 60 seconds or 120 seconds, but we're talking about a small amount of time to bake a matzah. So as such, we're not talking. Think short term, so short amounts of time. So Rabbi Gamliel says that everybody can bake together, start kneading your dough together. And there are basically 3 steps the Mishnah is going to talk about. The kneading of the dough, the stretching and flattening of the dough to make it into a bread, and then putting it into the oven and having it bake. So the Chachamim Ma'amrim, no, you can't do that. But rather, Shalosh Nashim Eiskes Batzik Achad, Achas Lashav Achas Ar Achas V'Achas Eifa. Rather, each one is going to do it, is going to be at a different stage. Rabbi Kiva says not all the women are the same, meaning some are quicker, some are slower. Not all the breads are the same. Some are quick, some are wet, some are dry, some burn better and hotter, and some don't. Not every oven is the same. If you see that it's starting to rise, you have to put it into cold water. So the Brisa taught Lasha, so the one who's kneading the dough. Now he mekatefes, she moves over to flattening it out to a bread. And her friend starts kneading tachtea in her place. Mekatefes, he oifa. So the one who was flattening the bread and making it into a bread now puts it into the oven. And the second woman now moves from having kneaded the dough into flattening it into a bread. And the third one is now going to begin kneading. Now the one who had baked the breads goes back to the beginning of the line and starts kneading another dough. and the one who was up to flattening it now moves into baking. Tachtel v'ashlishis, and the third one starts the step after kneading into flattening the bread. And they go around and around in this circle. Essentially, the assembly line, but the assembly line where each person does their own job all the way through, staggered, as opposed to where they just pass it off to the next one, because they were typically doing their own. Each one was making their own bread, and they just wanted to share the oven so that they can spare the share the cost of the heat. So as long as they're working on the dough, it will not become chametz. You don't have to assume that it would rise. Rabbi Kiva says that you can't make a general rule because every woman and every oven and every wood is going to be different. Tanya Rabbi Kiva Rabbi Kiva said, I asked Rabbi Gamliel, how can you say that everybody can just make their doughs together and put into the oven together? When you taught us this halacha, are you talking about really diligent women or women that are taking their time and just not focused? Is the wood dry wood or wet wood? Is how hot is this oven? Is it really hot oven or not so hot? He said, you're right. I mean, ultimately, you can't make a rule. The only rule you have is this is the rule. If it starts fermenting, it starts rising. If you see so put it into cold water to cool it down. So we had seen earlier this concept of dough seir that didn't fully rise, and it's really not edible at that point. What is the measure of having begun to rise that it's considered chametz? So seir yisarif. The first opinion says that seir, this not fully risen bread, has to be burnt. But if you eat it, you're going to be exempt because it's not really the edible type. So siduk yisarif. The idea is that if it's cracking on the surface, it has to be burned, and that is chametz proper, and therefore you would be chayiv. Kares, there's a kares for eating it. So ezu is seir. The first opinion says, what is seir? What measure is that? It's like grasshopper antennae, meaning that the cracks in the dough start to interlock with each other. That's different Rabbi Yehuda. However, the Chachamim say no. Either one of those are going to be kares. So what is seir that would be in a non-kares space yet? Like somebody got shocked and his hair stood up and his face turned white. So that's so too over here. The surface turns pale. So we have a brisa that says that seir is if the face turned pale. For somebody who had a shock and his hair stood up. But cracks like grasshopper antennae is going to be actual chametz. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's what Rabbi Meir says. What is seir that is not fully chametz? That's like in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda, the cracks of the antennae. Antennae of bugs, where the cracks sort of begin interlocking. And to that, Rabbi Meir says everybody's going to say it's kares. But to us, it says it's burnt. Rabbi Yehuda, that there is no kares for something like this. Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Meir, this would be kares. Because as we saw earlier in the Gemara, and we see in this Mishnah, Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that once it starts cracking on the surface, that's going to be real chametz. Only if it pales on the surface, that's not real chametz. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the cracking on the surface is not yet real chametz. Real chametz is when it actually is to the level of there are real cracks below cracks. Amarava, my time in the Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you cannot have a crack or two on the upper layer of the dough that inside it's not really blowing up enough that there are many cracks. And so he considers that a real chametz. Wishing you a great Shabbos and see you for the next daf, the next Mishnah